would like to welcome everyone here this afternoon to the continuation of the Global Justice Defining the Issues workshop. And I'm a member of the organizing committee for the Global Justice Action Summit, but I also coordinate the Jubilee Missoula Network. I'm very happy to be able to introduce Mary Clark and Jyoki Jehu, who are really instrumental in a lot of the things that go along with Jubilee in this country, and the formation and the running of the movement, which is also very, very grassroots oriented, but it's so important to have a partnership with organizations that are so strong and can be real leaders and give us real voices so that we can go out and make real change within our own communities. And some of the organizations that are local are People of Faith, People of Action, Missoula Women for Peace, Catholic Community Action, Community Action for Justice in the Americas. Don't forget anybody. Well, anyway, those are Caring for Creation Network. So if you're not a member and you would like to sign up to be part of the network so we can link with the national and do things locally and influence our own Congress, there will be some sign-up sheets tomorrow outside the Global Justice Forum. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jyoki Jehu. Did I do that right?
Not quite, but that's okay.
Okay, so I'm Jerobi, so I'm in Polish. You'd think I could do it right, but I always miss. And Jyoki is also with 50 Years is Enough, as so I was. And Jyoki's been very involved with the Jubilee USA Network and kind of the formation of our network. And I've been lucky enough to hear her speak around the country, in Michigan and Washington, D.C., and now in Missoula, Montana. So I'm also very lucky to have her, and I'll let her just carry on. Jyoki always says she comes from an oral tradition, so she really knows how to speak.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. I think that I speak for Marie when I say that we are delighted to be here. One of the really amazing things that has happened in the last years, I've been at 50 years now, almost for 6 years doing this work. The most amazing thing that has happened is this sort of thing that in places like Missoula, Carbondale, Colorado, in all kinds of little places where people and decision makers don't think that ordinary people care about global justice, ordinary people care about international debt, ordinary people care about corporate power. They do care, and they are organizing, and this entire weekend is a testament to that, and really inspired. You know, we live and work in Washington, D.C., the belly of the beast, and you find yourself often in places that are very scary. And for me, one of the really amazing things is to think about faces of people that I've seen in classrooms like this one, in church basements, in union halls, who care about these issues and who come to listen and who have a passion. So I'm adding a few more faces from Missoula, and having the knowledge that I'll be able to say that people in Missoula and in Montana do care about global justice and what's happening to other people around the world, and the ways in which democratic power and self-determination is being taken away from people and communities around the world and across the United States. So thank you for organizing this, everyone who's done all this work, and thank you all for coming to listen to us, because of course it could be organized, and I have organized, and I have been to things where only the organizers show up and no one else does. So it's great to be here and to be with all of you. How many people were in the last session? Show of hands. Okay, so about half and half. So we were talking about, you know, how much should we get into these issues, given that a lot of people were in the last session. And just very quickly to say that about the 50 Years is Enough network, that we were founded at the time of the 50th anniversary of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And I put it a little bit differently from the way it was put previously, is that the network is about educating people and exposing people to the fact that there are lots of bad things being done in their name and with their tax dollars by the U.S. government. U.S. policy is being done around the world in the name of taxpayers and with the money that we pay for, we pay taxes. And at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, where the United States is the single most powerful country, in fact, for some of the decisions, the U.S. holds virtual veto power, where for decisions, there are some decisions within the institutions that require 85% of the vote. Well, the United States holds about 18% of the vote at the institution. So if they decide that they want something or they don't want something, they can really, the United States can make that decision on their own. If they decide that they don't want something, we saw this actually happen with the election of the new about a year ago with the election of the new head of the International Monetary Fund. There's an agreement, there was that conversation about corruption in the last session. And, if we are really looking and opening up our minds about the ways in which corruption, sometimes it's done in a way that we accept that that's the way it is versus that there's something wrong with that. So, for instance, in 1944, there was this agreement that always the head of the World Bank would be an American citizen, and always the head of the IMF would be a European citizen. So when the new managing director of the IMF was being elected, there was a candidate from Japan who a lot of people thought was qualified, but he wouldn't even be considered because there's this agreement, from going back to 1944 that the head of the IMF would always be a European. I don't know. Perhaps it's nepotism at a grand scale or at an international level, but there are all these ways in which the system is really entrenched and reinforces itself, and part of that is the power that the United States government has within those institutions. And that's why I think that the education and organizing work and mobilizing work that we are seeing here this weekend and we see around the country every day, in fact, is really important so that people can understand what's going on. We are here to talk about international debt, and there's a lot that I think one could say about debt, and a lot has been said, and volumes have been published. And I think for me, the thing in talking about this issue, the thing to do is tell the stories of what the debt means and why we think that it is illegitimate. We think that it is an odious debt. We think that it is a debt that has been paid many times over, and that really what needs to happen is a profound sort of and transformative way of thinking about international debt and canceling it and doing away with it to allow countries to develop. So I want to start with showing you a cartoon. It's a cartoon that is from South Africa, and the first panel says, Africa then, and there's a guy with a rifle labeled the West, who has a chain that leads to the neck of this African man, and it says slavery. So that's Africa then. I hope you can all see it. And then the next one says Africa now. And it's kind of a same kind of guy labeled the West. He has sort of a clipboard. I think he looks a little bit like Greenspan myself, but and there's the same sort of looking kind of guy, African guy, and the chain around his neck now says debt. And I think that cartoon speaks volumes in terms of what is really going on with international debt, because it is not just that somebody borrowed or some people borrowed and now they have to pay. It really is, international debt is a tool of domination and maintaining power and control over economies from around the world. That's what is going on. If it was really just about debt and people paying what they owe, we would have a very different kind of system. In the last session, Erin talked about the fact that Nigeria has all this debt, and in 2000, the president of Nigeria wrote a letter to the Southern Baptist Convention. It turns out that the president of Nigeria is a Baptist. He had been invited to the convention of U.S. Baptists, and he couldn't come, but he sent a letter. And in the letter, he was urging the Baptists to support the call for debt cancellation. And he said, basically, this 2000, there's this call for Jubilee, but Nigeria cannot enjoy and cannot participate in this idea of Jubilee. And then he went on to say why. He said, in 1978, Nigeria borrowed $5 billion. To date, we have paid $16 billion. On the 5 that we borrowed, we have paid $16 billion. And we still owe $31 billion. Borrowed 5, have paid 16, and still owe $31 billion. How is that possible? We have a situation where the variable interest rates, so a lot of countries borrowed money at very low interest rates. They were not fixed. And so you could borrow at 4 or 5%. And then, with economic crisis and inflation and all of that, those loans, some of them went up as high as 21% interest rates, and it's compounded. So there's this cycle that is never ending. You can pay and pay and pay and pay, but you're never going to get out of it. And because there's this system that also continues, to reinforce the debt system. In fact, it's designed for countries not to be able to get out of it. How is that, perhaps you wonder? So let me give you an example. A lot of people hear about structural adjustment programs, and structural adjustment programs were the set of economic policies that were supposed to structurally adjust, reform and shape up countries that were having problems meeting their obligations. And so they were told, okay, we will help you, we will support you, but you need to implement a series of a series of policy changes. So I want to talk a little bit about what those means and then talk about how that reinforces debt. And so structural adjustment programs include privatization, where we see economies being in Peru, they're having these huge demonstrations. The current president was elected on a pledge that he would not privatize the power companies. Even signed a piece of paper saying as much. Well, guess what? He's privatizing, and people have taken to the streets, and there's a lot of trouble in Peru. And the reason why countries continue to privatize, even against their best interests, or even against the best interests of the people in the country, is because there's a system that, it's kind of like an addiction. They need the money, they need the loans, and in order to do that, they're required to do a number of things. So privatization is one. Devaluation of local currencies is another, where a lot of, you have money, but you're not able to buy as much as you used to be able to buy. Combined with that is the removal of subsidies. In a lot of countries, including in this country, actually, a lot of things are subsidized, whether overtly or covertly, but they're subsidized. So we saw about a year and a half ago in Jamaica where they removed the petrol subsidy, the gasoline subsidy. And what it meant for ordinary people is that the cost of transportation, public transportation, doubled because the people who own the buses increased the transportation cost, and people are still making the same amount of money, but from one day to another, the cost of transportation has gone up, and we've seen that with bread. Often you hear about bread riots. We've seen that in Nigeria in the last year with gasoline, with petrol. All those kinds of things are going on. Another one is where countries are asked to change the way they produce and orient themselves to being economies that are exporting. So if you're an agricultural country, you stop producing food for consumption and you start producing coffee, cash crops, non-food cash crops. So like Kenya, where I'm from, we've always grown coffee and tea and cotton and other things, but now there's a glut in the world market. Of coffee. You can't tell if you go to Starbucks where you have to pay $2 or $3 for a cup of coffee. But for coffee growers, it's really almost worthless. There's been incidents in Kenya where farmers, after working all year long, harvesting their coffee, and they weigh their options and they say, it would be better if I just dump this coffee in the river, because selling it means somebody gets a lot of money and we don't get any as farmers. If you Montana is an agricultural state. If you can imagine somebody putting their labor, their sweat, their capital into a year of production, and the end of it saying, it makes more sense for me to dump this rather than to market it, whether to the National Marketing Board in the case of coffee in Kenya. But, so coffee, there's a glut on coffee, and what now Kenya is growing is cut flowers. So, there are lots of roses and carnations and very nice looking flowers that are grown in greenhouses and overnight transported to European markets. So you can get, fresh roses that were cut in Kenya yesterday, arriving in European markets in London and in other places the following morning. And this export orientation is something else that is going on under structural adjustment programs. If you are a country that is not an agricultural country, then this is where you get into sweatshops and maquiladoras and those kinds of things. So whatever, they talk about comparative advantage. If you're a country that has a comparative advantage of having large numbers of unemployed people, you get these export processing zones, free trade zones, maquiladoras. They come under very different names, but it is very much the same idea. So I think you kind of get the idea in terms of what is included in structural adjustment programs. And in order to get these loans, so you're having problems paying your monthly or your yearly or monthly debt servicing amounts, and you go to the IMF and say, we need help. And they say, first, implement all those policies that I described and others, and then we'll give you more money to be able to service your debt. So how does this perpetuate debt? Imagine, change the mode and think about credit card debt. You have $10,000 or $15,000 worth of credit card debt. This month, you need to pay, your minimum payment is $1,000. You go to your credit card company and you say, I'm simply not going to be able to make it this month. I cannot make that payment. They say, no problem. What we are going to do is we are going to give you a loan. We'll give you a loan. If you can't make $1,000 payment, it probably means you don't have a lot of spreading around money. So we'll give you $1,000 loan, $1,500 loan. You pay us the $1,000, and then you have $500 more to spend. So, so that you're not just, left empty, you're with empty pockets. But to continue the analogy a little bit further, in order for us to give this to you, we need to examine the ways in which you're spending money. We need to look at the schools that your kids are going to. We need to look at what kind of health insurance you have. We need to look at your diet. We need to look at where you're living, whether you need to move into a smaller place where you pay less rent. Those are the conditions. So we'll help you, but you need to meet all these conditions. And in a way, this is what these institutions, the World Bank and the IMF in particular, the IMF is doing to countries, saying, you're having problems, we'll loan you more money so that you can make your payments. And so, if you had $10,000 worth or $15,000 worth of debt, you get $1,500. Now you owe them what? $16,500. And that's what keeps happening with countries. The other point that I want to make about this, and then I have this really interesting kind of briefing that was done on Zambia by some colleagues in Canada, and I want to read some excerpts from it because it's a really interesting example of a country. In fact, one of the little subtitles says, another, in parentheses, former IMF star people. Because there was a time Zambia was the example. This was the example to follow. The fact of the matter is that after 20 years of doing this, countries doing this, starting with Mexico, with the Mexico debt crisis in the early 80s, in the late 70s, early 80s, and even fast forwarding that crisis continuing in '95 with the peso crisis, the system hasn't worked. They keep saying to countries, you have to do this. You have, short-term pain for long-term gain. This is actually something that the IMF says to countries, short-term pain for long-term gain. Well, after 20 plus years, the pain is still there. Nobody can see the gain. The debt is growing. Impoverishment is increasing. Poverty is increasing. And, countries are more and more unable to meet the basic needs of their people. Now, a lot of, and I want to leave some stuff for Marie to talk about. A lot of this debt was accumulated in the, especially during the Cold War, where governments were given money. Literally, they knew Mobutu was stealing the money. They knew what was happening with Marcos and Somoza and the Duvaliers and Moi in Kenya. They knew exactly what was happening, but did they care? Really, no. And we can again talk about corruption. I really like to talk about this issue because now all of a sudden everybody finds out that there's corruption in the global south and they want to point to it. But for years and years in Kenya, where I'm from, people say to cut off the government. All this money is being stolen, and they didn't do it until 1997. That was when the IMF finally cut off Kenya on the charges of corruption. But we saw, in fact, last year in November when I was in Kenya, the IMF and World Bank saying we'll resume lending if you sign an anti-corruption act. But the anti-corruption act that they were saying to Parliament, if you sign it, we will resume lending to Kenya, had a clause. And nobody really, for people who know Kenya, nobody could believe that actually the Kenyan Parliament had the gumption to say no. Had a clause saying that if you had committed economic crimes, before 1998, there was amnesty. So nobody would ask any questions if you had stolen money before 1998. And we're talking about a country that has $8 billion worth of debt, supposedly. So let's forget the past and look from 1998. And the Kenyan Parliament said no, but a lot of the loans were for really bad and corrupt projects. So I want to actually stop here and read a couple of excerpts from this, just to show you Zambia is a country that started at a place where the IMF said you're doing everything right, you're great, and good things are in store for you. And to see where Zambia is in 2000 to 2001. So Zambia has a population of 9.9 million people. And right now, life expectancy in Zambia, can you take a guess what the life expectancy at birth in Zambia is?
35.
It's actually 41, and it's gone down, And in countries, you hear in Tanzania, 40% of the population dies before the age of 35. 40% of the population dies before the age of 35. If you imagine, the people who are here who are around 35 or less, and imagine that 40% of them would be dead before they hit the age of 35. Infant mortality, 112 out of every 1,000 live births die. Out of every 100,000 women giving birth, 649 of them die at childbirth. There are 7 physicians, 7 doctors for every 100,000 people. 7 physicians for every 100,000 people. 20% of the adult population is HIV positive. Adult literacy is at 76.3%. For kids under about the age of 5, and population age 5 years and above with no education, 27% of the population above age 5 do not have any education. And I didn't talk about user fees, so I hope you will be doing that. There's 73% of the population spends or lives on about $25 a month, 73%. And about 58% of the population lives on $15 or less a month. So in 2001, Zambia spent $149 million in servicing debt to the World Bank, to the IMF, to the US government, and other wealthy creditors. They spent only $24 million on health for the 9.9 million people in the country. 24 million in 2000 on health, and only 33 million on education. So this is a former IMF staff pupil. They did everything, the IMF held them up because they were doing everything right. So I want to just read a couple quotes for you. This is from a quote by the Zambian finance minister. And these guys, they're not opposed to neoliberalism. They're not opposed to structural adjustment programs. In fact, part of the problem is that the elites and the people in government are often very willing to impose structural adjustment programs. For the most part, they don't have to deal with it. In Kenya, we have a phenomenon where a lot of people in government and a lot of people, wealthy people, are dying overseas. Because when they get sick, they don't have to go to the hospitals where people are sleeping to a bed and where there are no doctors or no medication. They get on a plane and they go to South Africa, they come to the US, they go to Europe. So you begin to see that happening. A lot of wealthy people send their kids overseas for education. They don't have to go to the university that gets closed every so often, every time students are upset about tuition or the quality of education and all of that. And they don't have to go to schools where the teachers are very poorly trained and poorly paid and where there's no equipment. When Secretary O'Neill was in Africa a few weeks ago, he was saying about how shocked he was to find out that there were places where 6 students were sharing a textbook. This was, what he took from all of that. I mean, at least they had a textbook to share. He didn't talk about the students who don't have a textbook at all, and maybe the only textbook in each grade is the one that the teacher has. So the finance minister of Zambia last April said, in spite of the uninterrupted implementation of structural reforms over the past 10 years, we have noted also a sharp increase in the incidence of poverty among people of Zambia, a situation that is not politically and socially suitable. So this is a guy who has followed the advice and is saying it's not working. On the program, the debt relief program of the World Bank and the IMF, Jubilee Zambia said, we believe that the HEPIC offer to Zambia does not differ significantly from the usual IMF and World Bank approaches to debt, poverty reduction, and development. The limitations of the HEPIC initiative discredit as a solution to Zambia's debt crisis. So probably when you talk to your member of Congress, when you lobby people or you call your representative at the World Bank and the IMF, they say, we are doing something about debt. We have this HEPIC initiative. And then there's a quote here from one of our colleagues from Washington, Sally Booker, who couldn't be here actually. He had intended to come here and then go on to Calgary, but he couldn't. And in a story that he wrote for the Mail and Guardian in 2000, he says, the case of Zambia has, perhaps more clearly than any other, laid bare the myth of HEPIC debt relief. Even with the full implementation of the HEPIC initiative, Zambia's debt crisis will not be lessened. Its government will be no more able to address a national health emergency. Its people will be no less tied in a cycle of deprivation. The current debt relief framework has failed Zambia, just as it has failed other highly indebted poor countries across Africa and the global south. The cancellation of Zambia's debt is the only rational response to the failure of the HEPIC initiative. So after the HEPIC initiative, which was introduced in 1999 to kind of preempt the momentum of Jubilee and all kinds of other debt relief schemes that have existed actually now for decades. There's always been something, and other things that are done on an ongoing basis. So for instance, with Pakistan joining the war against terrorism, they went from having sanctions against them because they had a military dictator who had taken power from one day to being ahead of the line for debt relief. We've seen debt relief from when the King of Jordan died. Jordan got a lot of their debt relieved because the U.S. wanted to support the transformation to, the democratic transfer of power from the father to the son. We've seen, we saw Poland in 1991, get a lot of debt relief around, again, this sort of, transformation from communist to, I don't know, capitalist or whatever they were calling themselves. So debt relief is an ongoing thing that happens for political reasons. And the call for Jubilee and the call for, Jubilee debt cancellation is saying enough. The cost to people, to the environment, to children, to the health of and well-being of people is too much for moral reasons. You know, the economic arguments haven't worked. You know, that's what the Brady Plan and all these other things have been. For moral reason, the Jubilee debt cancellation demand is to make sure that we don't continue really to sacrifice generations on the altar of neoliberal economic policy. So I'll let Marie take it from there.
Let's do your little thing.
Oh, yes.
Well, thanks, Jyoki. Let's see where to go from here. There's so much. And basically what I'd like to do is take you a step further and tickle your brains outside of the usual box that we talk about debt in. Usually when we talk about debt, and certainly as you can hear from Jyoki and from many of the things that she was saying, and from sort of the sessions before us, these countries are not able to pay on this debt. In fact, they've paid over and over again. The Nigeria example is a perfect one for that. And we focus on things still sometimes even within the same economic framework, where we think, okay, you know, this country's borrowed. There was certainly all of these other circumstances that led into the reason why countries were borrowing in the first place. And then interest rates were going skyrocketing. Oil prices were going up, coffee and other export production prices were going down, and these countries became unsustainably in debt and they cannot pay. And in response to that, the World Bank and the IMF present things like this HIPC, this Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, and all of their structural adjustment conditions that Jyoki has successfully completely debunked as being the fraud that they are, because they're still responding to this idea that the countries owe and they just can't pay. And what we've been hearing from our Southern partners, and what Jyoki actually started her talk with, was that you're on the wrong track. That yes, it's true, our countries cannot pay, but it's worse than that. We don't owe and we won't pay. That it is impossible for our countries to pay, but it's actually more important to look at how our countries don't owe. And that's what Jyoki began in her very first statement. These are debts that are illegitimate. And that's where you go beyond payability, beyond the economic indicators, as horrifying as they are, and start to ask the question, why are these countries in the space that they're in? What has been the culture of colonialism that Jyoki showed in the cartoon that has turned into to a new form of debt slavery? And what are the elements that make the case, both legally in terms of the precedents of odious debt that Soren had shared in the session before? For those of you who were here, he shared about how there's actually a legal case that has been made that there are some debts that could be considered odious. There are debts that have been forced upon a country by an illegitimate...
forced upon the people.
Forced upon the people by an illegitimate leaders, often to suppress the very own people. So there's certainly a legal basis, but that's fairly narrow in the terms of law. And what I'd like to do is for us to talk a little bit more about what would it mean to say that these debts are fundamentally illegitimate, that they're not only morally wrong, but they should be annulled because they're illegitimate debts. It's ridiculous for us to collect them. They shouldn't just be relieved or forgiven under plans like HIPC, but they should be completely annulled as if they had never existed, for they had no right to exist. And so to kind of look into that, that sort of sense of how can you make such a claim as that these debts are illegitimate? Didn't these countries borrow? Didn't they use the money? What about corruptions? That's a favorite first-time response. You know, how can you make that case that these are illegitimate? And
I would just like to say that I've studied this issue for many years. I think these loans are a deliberate attempt to devalue currencies, like, for instance, the Brazilian Cruzeiro, where what they did was they took off 3 zeros. Imagine you have a $10,000 bill, and all of a sudden it was stamped $10 instead of 10,000. So people can relate that. I'd like to pass this around so people can take a look at this. That's really what it means to people. What it is, it's the rape of their natural resources, and it's instead of importing slaves, you get slaves right where they are and just import their products. That's basically what it is. It's real simple.
Well, that sums it up, so we can actually go right into discussion and any types of questions. No, I think that's true. I think that is sort of the starting place. And when we look at case studies and take country by country and start to examine where the debt has come from, what has been the historical context of these countries, what have been the projects that have been lent to, and what was the relationship between the wealthy nations and these countries. In each case we're finding, because we're actually doing a study about this right now at Jubilee, in each case we're finding that in the history of these countries there has been a long history of colonization that changed hands time and again, and even after leaders were able to come into power, the relationships were ensured to stay in the favor of the former colonizing powers, like for example in the case of the Philippines, where the United States had been one among many countries that had been determining the future of the Philippine policies and everything. And when the Filipinos got their independence, the United States wanted to ensure this relationship that had been so profitable to the United States, so they forced upon the Filipinos something called the Bell Act, where they required that the Filipino government sign away their ability to regulate their products on the market, and that they would have free trade between the U.S. and the Philippines, actually really free trade until 1954, but then after that the United States would be able to offer and then increase by 5% tariffs on Filipino goods. But however, the Philippines could not put in any of their own tariffs to match this or to try and create an equilibrium. And the threat of that was used to get the Filipino government to sign on to an agreement, which was clearly not in their favor, was that the Filipinos would not get the reparations that they needed for the war charges that had been put on the United States and on others. And so here they were forced into this situation that clearly didn't benefit them, and we can look at that historical relationship and we can say, okay, already we're starting from a space that's not an equal playing field. Already a country is being forced into a space where they will enter into indebtedness. But if that weren't enough, we can look at some of the projects that were put forward in the Philippines. And now, first let me tell you now, the IMF and the World Bank would not tell you that Philippines is an interesting study, because they'd say that Philippines actually doesn't need any debt relief or any debt help because they are not a heavily indebted poor country. And so as a result, we should kind of ignore the Philippines since they can take care of themselves.
This is Haiti is not a heavily indebted poor country because there's a technocratic formula that they use to determine who is a heavily indebted poor country, and you know how they do that and not include Haiti is beyond the pale. I mean,
right. Philippines, Haiti, Bangladesh, all of these are countries that are not eligible for debt relief under the IMF and the World Bank. So what happens in the case of the Philippines is that the World Bank and the IMF come in again to help broker a deal in 1976 with a company called Westinghouse. And Westinghouse came to the Philippines and offered to build a nuclear power plant. And this sounded like a good plan to the current dictator Marcos, who entered into an agreement with a $2.3 billion power plant. And so the process went forward, and this power plant now represents about 5% of Filipino current debt. The problem with the power plant was that it was built on a fault line. So there was absolutely no power that was going to be able to be generated from this plant that was built on the fault line. Westinghouse was paid back in full, and about $170,000 a day have been paid by the Filipinos in interest on the loan that they had taken out for this power plant for Westinghouse. And they need to pay that daily interest until 2018 to be able to fund a nuclear power plant that was built on a fault line. Marcos, the dictator at the time, walked away with an $80 billion commission on this power plant and for brokering the deal with Westinghouse, but of course walked away. 80 million.
I think it's somehow disturbing to see like how all this when you hear about this corruption, because like the other day I was reading this thing on the web about a case going on in Tanzania right now because they're saying IMF officials they try to bribe the Tanzania officials to accept a project. One time I was talking to somebody who told me that she writes projects for African countries on IMF and World Bank. So to me it's really amazing to find you sitting in Washington writing projects for African countries, and yet it's not the countries themselves that are writing this project saying they need the money. So, and that somehow like, it even brings an issue where like all this circulation of the money. But it's really a disturbing issue, finding that there's need, where these institutions, they're asking for this money back, but then the ones who wrote these projects, with all these so-called white elephants, and people the countries are not benefiting from it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's another one of the key tenets when you talk about arguing the case for illegitimate debt is, first of all, what is the historical context? Who was lent to, and were they known dictators, as in the case of Marcos or Mobutu? What participation did civil society have in developing the development plan or the project that's being lent to? And what was the nature of that project? Is it a Westinghouse project of a nuclear power plant on a fault line? Or is it something else that is equally perverse? And where was the process of determination by civil society in creating these development spaces for the country? And looking at, can you qualify it as odious debt? Can you look at fraud and usury and look at the situations surrounding that debt, and then really can you claim that this is a debt that should be paid? Did you have a question? I thought I saw another hand over in that space. So we've been coming a little bit further, I think, in the dialectic on debt. For the past several years, people have started to talk about all over the country how it's important for us to get on board with debt cancellation, how we have an obligation as U.S. taxpayers to use our voice and say, you cannot do this in our name, you cannot collect on these debts in our name. We need to have debt cancellation, we need it now. But still, I'd like us to take it further and really go beyond debt cancellation and question whether or not these debts should exist in the first place, whether these are illegitimate debts that should be annulled, which is far more than canceled. So Jubilee USA Network, in working with 50 Years, has started a real project on illegitimate debt to try and take this debate further, to try and raise up a popular movement on illegitimate debt that our Southern partners have been calling for years. And are doing a series of case studies of countries that'll be bound up and on our website and then able to be distributed, that goes country by country and looks at the situation and makes the case for why these debts are illegitimate. And so that's some of what's going on here, but it's not alone. This is something that Jubilee South and some of our other Southern partners have been calling for years. For years they've been addressing this and saying, we don't owe, we won't pay. Look at question the legitimacy of the debts. Start to ask yourselves, really, who owes whom in this scenario? When our resources are being flooded from our countries to yours, who owes whom while we pay back debt after debt? In fact, I think from 1990 to 1997, the Global South as a whole paid back more in their debt service than they had taken out in new loans. So clearly, this question has been coming from our colleagues in the South and has been challenging us to take action.
I don't know if this fits in with a legal standpoint, but Esquivel, and I can't remember his first name, the Costa Rican man who won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Argentinian Adolfo?
Adolfo Esquivel, yes, Argentina, thank you. Years ago was saying, we paid you many times over with our gold, our silver, our trees. We don't owe you a thing. I mean, way back then he was saying that.
Yes, this is not a new concept, certainly not. But I think it is something that we're not hearing as much about here in this country. I think in this country, most of the time when we talk about debt, people are really getting into this space where they can make an articulate case for how countries can't pay and it's important for cancellation. And I would like for all of us to work together and to be brainstorming maybe in some of our discussion time about how we can turn the discussion from payability, using that where it's appropriate, and into questions of legitimacy, into questioning the very nature of this debt, because it'll, I think, allow us to open our minds into really questioning the system as a whole that continues to perpetuate a space of dominance. I see the question there, but maybe I can just wrap up my presentation so that we can go full on into the questions and debates, and just say that as a final kind of example, and one that I hope will be taken to court soon, and that's the example of South Africa. And I'd like to ask you to imagine that you were imprisoned by an unjust power. And for the years that you were in prison, you started to actually get quite a reputation. In fact, people were talking about you all the time because you were a great example of how this power was unjust. And so when you were released, you are from prison, you get elected to be the president of your country, and you're excited because you're building up a whole new world, you're building up a new democracy, a whole new space, and you're handed with a bill. And this is the case of South Africa. South Africa is now paying back the debts of the oppressors that had oppressed the people with the money, and that's that money that they're paying back person by person in South Africa. And this is just a couple of the cases, and I think they call us into powerful action. They call us into action now on debt. But I see already people are asking questions, and it's hot, and it's in the afternoon, so why don't we actually go into time of discussion and questions.
Well, I see that there is a cause and effect relationship, of course, between the debtor countries and the United States. One of the effects is increased immigration. When people lose their lands, for example, take the large landowners who expropriate land from peasants, especially for cattle ranches or other cash crops. These people, many of them migrate to the major cities like Mexico City, etc. When there's no work there, then they come here to the United States. Then there is a backlash here in the United States of people that say, let's shut down the borders. Let's put the army on the border. And trying to make it seem like it's the fault of the Mexican people that they're lazy, they don't want to work, that's why they're in debt. And I think there's a lot of misconception about the reasons why these third world countries are in debt, and of course what the debtor countries can do about it. I think that the case of Chavez in Venezuela is a case in point where they tried to destabilize his government. And what I think is that these countries need to do the same thing as OPEC. They need to organize, they need to get together, they need to make a similar organization of debtor countries, a debtor cartel.
The concept of a debtor cartel is one that's also being talked about with the growing interest in countries or civil society in different countries being able to encourage their governments to actually just stop paying on the debt and to repudiate the debt, as they say, just to stop paying. And the threat to, of course, to countries that try to do something like stop paying on their debt is that they wouldn't be able to have the good line of credit with the IMF and the World Bank and participate in the markets. So the idea of a debtors cartel or a drawing together of countries would be to enable countries to join together in groups and be able to trade with one another and to be able to support themselves. This is a really challenging thing to do. Can you imagine the United States joining up together in friendly, complete cooperation with other countries to be able to do this? Imagine how difficult it is for countries, even if they're experiencing the same oppression from these forces, to be able to come together and do this. So the work that civil society is doing to make that happen is so heroic. It is so heroic because it's overcoming an incredible amount of obstacles and saying, we are going to use our powers coming together with teachers and trade unionists and other folks to be able to influence our governments to be able to try and create alternatives at the macro level. Because already alternatives are existing within countries that are powerful alternatives to our economic model, and they're working, but it's usually in the smaller levels. Did you have a question?
Yeah, a couple of points. First of all, payability is really critical issue here for countries that are unable to pay. How much time and effort should be spent in distinguishing between, forget your term, legal or illegal debt? That's one question. I mean, you can spend a lot of time doing that study, but if the bottom line is we can't pay, then why just go for debt forgiveness in that situation? Secondly, why should one focus on illegal debt and forgive that? I mean, it seems to give the wrong signals. If I was being very cynical about it, I would say if I was a finance minister in a developing country, I'd make damn sure all of my debt was illegal. So I would have a basis to have it dispensed. It's illogical to me.
Certainly the call to try and look at these questions of legitimacy or illegitimate debt in context of and in comparison with the payability question is not to undercut the need for immediate debt cancellation or to say that it doesn't matter that these countries can't pay at all and to ignore some of the really powerful statistics on that. Certainly it's not to take away from any of the time and energy that's spent to get immediate debt cancellation. On the contrary, it's to try and draw the debate into these sort of larger issues of power relations and understanding the historical context of these debts so that we can understand the nature of the system that creates and perpetuates this problem. Because when we do that, we can start to dismantle it. And of course, this doesn't go over very well with the people who are benefiting from the system. So I think that would be my response to your first question. I don't know if Joki, you want to respond as well.
I think that there are a number of issues that come up when you look at the question of illegitimate debt, and from starting with the sort of precedents that have been set in the case of the U.S. and Cuba, where actually Cuba's debt to Spain when there was a change of colonial masters was declared odious, and so the new colonial master, which was the U.S. in that case, was not obligated to pay that debt. And this is the doctrine of odious debt is something that we're pointing to. So there was the example of South Africa, where after 27 years, Nelson Mandela walks out of jail, becomes president, and he is forced, and his government is forced to service and to continue to pay apartheid's debt. The United Nations declared apartheid a crime against humanity. I mean, I don't think that there was anyone left, unless you were a Boer or an Afrikaner in South Africa benefiting from the system, that thought this was a good system. People felt that this was a very oppressive system. And through the struggle for liberation, there were all these promises that had been made to people of South Africa. I was just in South Africa last week, promises, not last week, but last month actually in May, promises made about education for blacks who had been excluded, and coloreds and Indians, housing, access to water and electricity, really basic healthcare, all of those kinds of things, which get put on hold because even though the debt was accumulated as part of the process that kept them oppressed to buy the guns and the bombs and the guns and the helicopter gunships and all of that to keep them oppressed, that they now have to pay twice for apartheid, back when the system was in place and now in paying back the debt. The other question is, even if a country can pay, and many countries are continuing to pay, at what cost? At what cost? Are we willing to say that this principle of debt servicing is so, sacred that we have to do it no matter what? 19,000 children, not our figures, 19,000 children die in Africa every single day because governments are sending money to creditors instead of spending it on food security and immunization and clean water and et cetera, et cetera. Are we willing to say that that's an okay thing to maintain this, sacredness or whatever you want to call the issue of debt is? And I think that the Jubilee call for debt cancellation is that we are saying no. And when you just look at the math, I mean, the example of Nigeria, I think, is perhaps, I don't know if it's the worst case or the most outrageous, but it's very, very clear. And so, in a way, it's making as many arguments as we can about what is wrong with the system and what is wrong with the debt. Holding people accountable. Right now, the only people who have been held accountable are really the borrowers and people in borrowing countries, the ones who don't get clean water and who don't get health immunization and who don't get health, the ones where the mothers who are dying at the rate of 600 plus out of every 10,000 in Zambia. We are saying that the creditors also need to be held accountable. They were culpable in the accumulation and sort of the creation of this debt. We heard about the Bataan nuclear power plant in the Philippines. In Argentina, in the midst of the crisis in Argentina, there's $30 billion of the $120 billion that Argentina owes, $30 billion of debt where no one has a single piece of paper that says this is what this debt was. It's only the creditors know that it exists and they're demanding payment, but on the Argentinian side, the paperwork doesn't exist. A loan to build this road, and I give him another loan. And we are all colluding because there is no accountability in the system. Is that if you owe, you get to pay no matter what. And then the last thing, and in fact for those loans for Brazil, a lot of it is thought to have funded the war with the Falkland Maldives war that they had, Malvinas war that Brazil had with the United Kingdom. And then the last example that I want to give is Uganda was the first country in 1999 to be a recipient of the HIPC debt relief. Within 11 months, they were actually back to where they had started because it was they do all these calculations and it was based on the price of coffee. And the price of coffee, kind of hit the floor and Uganda was back to where they were. But even as Uganda is now back to where they were and they're paying more than they can afford to, and there are all these problems. This Monday of this week, we were outside the World Bank because the World Bank is fixing to make a $215 million loan to Uganda. And this is what I was talking about, this system that perpetuates the debt. So maybe you get a bit of debt relief here, but you're accumulating more debt. And the $215 million that the political risk insurance arm of the World Bank is getting ready to give to Uganda is part of a $550 million package to build a dam in Uganda, which for many reasons is believed to not be what Uganda needs, and certainly adds to the debt. So, I mean, we can kind of talk in general about the concepts, but when we look at the specifics, I think that I'm hard pressed to say that, what Uganda needs is another $500 million in debt, and the debt relief that they got in '99 was not even that much. And in looking, let me wrap up by saying that in looking at the question of legitimacy, looking at HIPC and how it has failed, and there's a really great briefing, 4-page briefing on the failures of HIPC from our perspective, and actually from a huge report that the World Bank and the IMF themselves did in April. So I encourage you to take a look at it. That HIPC is about charity and about kind of people assuaging their conscience and saying we don't like children dying and we want to look like we're doing something about it. The call for Jubilee debt cancellation is about justice, changing the system and the terms of those relationships, so that instead of now HIPC has actually there was HIPC 1 99, 96. Enhanced HIPC in '99, and now they're talking about HIPC 3. Instead of continuing to do this kind of treadmill where a little gets off the books, but not enough to make a difference, we're talking about justice and changing the terms of this, and really, very importantly, holding the lenders accountable because they haven't been held accountable at all.
That's a question. That's a question.
There's a woman here. We've gotten a lot of questions from men, and so let's get her and then get Karen. gender parity is a big thing.
I was just wondering if anything's been done on a UN level, or if they're capable of doing anything with this issue.
There was just a United Nations Financing for Development conference that was supposed to actually deal with this issue. But what has happened, the system is rotten to the core, if you haven't figured out that yet. And what they keep doing is that every arena that opens up to deal with these issues, the same players come into it. So now they're talking, there's this new word, they're actually taking our words away from us. They're now talking about convergence. It used to be that you could actually count on UN conventions and treaties to be a place where different statements were being made about the world that we lived in and the values that we have and that we hold dear, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to treaties around landmines and other things. Now they're talking about convergence, so that every arena that opens up, the financing for development was going to look at how development was financed, but also the issue of debt. You ended up having the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization as participants and actually equal players in that mix. And of course, civil society for the first time was actually involved in a UN process. But they don't have the same weight and they don't have the same sort of power within those institutions. So the UN is basically being made impotent by having the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization come in and say, we already have an existing framework and you shouldn't be looking at something different. Everything gets fed through this. It's the same thing that has happened with the Global AIDS Fund. It's what is looking like is going to happen. Actually, what is happening with the World Summit on Sustainable Development 10 years after the Earth Summit in Johannesburg, in August, and the World Trade Organization is saying, if you're going to say anything about trade, you need to look at what we decided in Doha at the World Trade Ministerial, and there needs to be convergence. You can't go off and sort of think outside the box and come up with new ideas. So the UN has great research, great statements. The figure of 19,000 children dying in Africa every day because countries are spending money on debt relief instead of basic services. They're doing great research, but that is what it's left as. Karen?
Thank you. Just first of all, I agree with everything you're saying.
Oh, good.
And then Bolivia, the bishops of Bolivia several years ago were asked also to write a letter to ask for forgiveness of debt, and they refused. And they said the IMF and World Bank should write a letter asking our forgiveness. And so there are groups that are very aware, but I do think there's how will this debt cartel, how do we help move this forward? I know it's not an action session as such, but part of the problem at the UN, and we're representatives of Maryland at the UN, as you know, and the UN is only as strong as the governments are. And a lot of the governments do not voice the wishes of the people, and including, our beloved government in Kenya. It's a bit wobbly at times. There's some good people there, but the government is shaky. And if you look at what people have said in Kenya, I know individuals and small groups, but the majority of people that I know and that we work with are still concerned very much about the local situation of corruption and violence and politics. And you ask them to get into this, and they kind of agree with you, but they don't have, they're in a kind of a survival. So I'm wondering, how can you get a debt cartel with governments who have been weakened in many ways by outside forces, and the civil society itself is struggling just to survive. So, and the UN, which should be a strong voice for these things, because I can see there are good voices within the UN system itself, and some good governments. But many of the governments, even from the 77 group, can be bought off or sidetracked. So where, I don't want to paint a terrible, negative scenario, I don't think that's the case. My thing is it's a new thing, and where do you see the action taking place which might make a difference? I don't mean it next week, but we have a sustained campaign like you had the original Jubilee campaign that made some difference, and I think it still doesn't make a difference. It may be a 10-year campaign, but where do you see it coming? And how can that be a source of convergence in a good sense to make a difference?
Maybe I'll start. I think that there's several different ways that we should be going, or we can think about going forward in this. And I think it will need that type of energy that came around the Jubilee 2000 to the year 2000 here in this country and around the world to be able to push something forward like this, because you've enumerated the challenges, the obstacles that are faced, and I think especially the NAPAD agreement, which you will all hear about more tomorrow morning, is a good example of how challenging this is, where governments have come together and put together an agreement, and this is to be the African voice, but it sounds pretty familiar. It's a voices that's ringing like things that have been going on for a while. And when I think of how do we then campaign, like literally how do we bring on this a new type of understanding on debt, the first thing that I want to do is to ask our Southern partners, what are you doing in your countries and how can we be supportive of you, so that this is all happening in solidarity, and so this is happening in a global way. And some of the things that are happening in other countries that I hope that we can get kick-started here, and I'd need you to do it, actually, to help us make it happen, are, for example, there's a couple things. So the first thing is audits. Around the world, civil society are starting a process of trying to ask their government to audit what they borrowed. Who did they borrow it from? What was it used for? And what are we paying on those loans? So that there can be transparency within these countries about this, and some of these questions of legitimacy and payability are raised up to the forefront and can start to spark conversation. What about an audit here? Let's audit our lending. I would like to know, where have we lent? To whom? How much? How was it used? What were the conditions that were on those loans? What was the process by which we have been collecting debt on those loans? Was it done through an export credit agency with a complete moral hazard where the companies got secure and they had sort of asked those questions? So I think one thing that we could start thinking about is an audit campaign something that would raise awareness in this country to help us to demand, where does our taxpayer dollar go? And at the same time, we'd be doing this in solidarity with audits that were coming up from around the South. So I'd like to hear your opinions on whether that sounds exciting. But before more questions, I think the other thing that has been in this idea of repudiation of a debtor's cartel and saying we're not going to pay any longer on a debt, I think that only further fuels our activism here to call for the cancellation and annihilation of these debts, and to be able to build an atmosphere in which our government would not tighten the screws on countries that decided not to pay. At this point, if a country decides that they're not going to pay back the IMF and the World Bank, you can better believe the United States will be right on that country, and the IMF and the World Bank as well. So how do we build a culture? And exactly, militarily as well. So how do we build a culture in this country where we establish a different norm, where it would be unacceptable for our government to respond in that way, and where the only logical response is cancellation?
Sorry, there are a couple other people who had hands up, 1, 2, and somebody in the back, and you actually have already spoken. So let's try to mix it up a little bit with people who haven't spoken and women. So go ahead.
I'd just like to know if, assuming that there could be debt cancellation, how would you proceed from then on to help the countries? What would be the process for loans at that point, and would that be an option?
So I think that, let me just clarify a couple of things about what happens when countries get debt relief or debt cancellation. For the most part, when we hear that Mozambique will be the recipient of $3.7 billion of debt relief, a lot of people imagine a check written to the government of Mozambique, $3.7 billion. But that actually is not what happens. What happens is that as debt service payments come due, the government doesn't have to send them to creditors. So that's a really important thing for people to understand, that it's not that governments, creditors are writing checks for the amount of debt relief. 1. 2, that for the debt relief that the World Bank and the IMF have been doing, the HIPC debt relief, they've been very, very crafty about it. They have said, we want to do debt relief, fine, we'll do debt relief, but we don't have money to do debt relief. So if the United States government thinks that debt relief is a good idea, if Germany, if Japan, if Italy, if the Scandinavians think that debt relief is a good idea, we'll set up this trust fund. It's called the HIPC Trust Fund, and they can put their money, make contributions to the HIPC Trust Fund, and we will apply that to the debts that to the servicing that doesn't happen. So what that means, this idea of an audit in the U.S. context is a really interesting one. But on the ground, in countries like Tanzania and Uganda and Mozambique and other countries, and actually out of a list of about 41, depending on how you count, about 5 to 7 countries have actually received actual debt relief out of a list of 41 that the World Bank and the IMF came up with since 1996. So that's how much they have done. But on the ground, for groups that are campaigning for debt relief and debt cancellation, reparations, or different things in each country, what they're saying is that then they want to be able to know if my government is not sending, in Zambia for instance, if the government of Zambia get debt relief and they don't have to send $149 million to creditors this year, where does that money go so that it doesn't kind of get fudged and disappear in the budget? And Uganda has probably the best example, where they formed what are called poverty action funds. There was a commitment made that the savings from debt relief would go to to primary education. And these poverty action funds were formed. People in the countryside were informed that they should expect to see some money coming in to build schools, to pay for teachers, etc. And donors, the creditors, the government of Uganda, and civil society, NGOs, trade unions, farmers associations, religious leaders, all were part of the Poverty Action Fund, really following up and monitoring to make sure that the money gets spent for the priorities that they have set. In fact, your question about what happens after if the problem of debt is dealt with, and the demand is, and what we are saying is that we need to rethink how borrowing and lending gets done. That there is accountability on both sides. Not just, what creditors have always relied on is that they will get paid no matter what. So, Mobutu, the IMF in 1982 sent someone to Kinshasa to find out what Mobutu was doing with the money. And he came back and said, not only will Zaire never be able to pay back, all this money is being stolen. In fact, Mobutu boasted that if he wanted to, he could pay the debt of Zaire. He could just pay it right out. How does a president get to be more wealthy than the country and be able to make that kind of a statement? Well, you imagine that if somebody that the IMF sends to Kinshasa comes back and says, well, he's stealing the money and they're not going to ever be able to pay that, then the IMF says, not another dime, right? I mean, that would be a reasonable expectation. Guess what? That's not what happened. The IMF gave Mobutu another $650 million. From that point to the time he was run out, the World Bank gave him another $600 million, and the West, including the United States, gave him another $3.5 billion. So 8 years from the time that this report was made, at the time that the report was made, Zaire owed $5 billion. When he died 8 years later, the debt had grown from $5 billion to $13 billion. So it's really a question of not just that countries won't be able to take out loans. I think if a country decides that they want to take out a loan, it's not up to me, it's not up to any of us to say yes or no, you can't. But that how that is done is really the big question. In 58 years, the World Bank has never said no to a project. And for most part, part of the Washington consensus that is so much talked about is the neoliberal, the trickle-down economic theory and orthodoxy. But part of it is also people sitting in Washington and deciding what Kenya needs, what Nicaragua needs, what the Philippines needs is X, Y, Z. They never, I mean, they never, most of them never even went to the, you be a Kenya country representative. Most of them never went to those countries. 4 years ago when they started doing that, they actually, it was covered by the news. It was in the news that these representatives, the people making decisions about loans to the Philippines and to Sri Lanka, in fact, they focused on this woman who was the country representative for Sri Lanka, went to Sri Lanka for the first time, spent 2 weeks and slept among the people, sleeping on the floor. This was news. This was in the Financial Times. For 58 years, they've never said no to a project. They've never come across a project that they didn't like. And they made, for the most of that time, the decisions were made. It wasn't even governments coming to and saying we need this project in our country. It was people at the World Bank saying, they were rated and they were promoted and got recognition by how much money they moved out of the bank, how much money, how many millions they loaned. So they scrapped their brains to make all kinds of loans. 2 loans for one, for the same projects, a loan for a project that goes over, 10, 11 times, like the nuclear power project in the Philippines that we've heard about. No one cared. And so the future lending and borrowing gets to be refined and revamped. It doesn't get done in the same way. That's a really big point. And part of it is that for now, and for the most part, the people who are making these decisions, they come to Kenya, for instance, they meet with the finance minister, the central bank governor, maybe the president. Whether it's an education loan or an environmental loan, they don't meet with anyone else. There's a lot of opaqueness, no transparency in how this is done, in how decisions are made. You've been really patient, I'm sorry. One more question, maybe, yeah.
I just want to ask, who are the banks that are behind this kind of a financial system?
Well, Bank of New York, just recently exposed as, there was a story in the Financial Times where they said that they had all this money from somebody named Abacha, who was, if you know anything about Nigeria, this was a dictator from Nigeria named Abacha, and the Bank of New York, they were also caught with their hand in the till, as it was in the case of Mexico and the Salinas presidency and the brother of Salinas. So they said, we had this money coming from somebody named Abacha, and we were led to believe that these 2 guys were the sons of a Zachary Abacha, a businessman of good reputation from Nigeria. And that's all they have to say about it. Bank of New York, Citibank, a lot of, think about the big, big multinational banks, a lot of them European banks in Zurich and Geneva, in Paris, in London. And this is another issue. As we talk about stolen wealth and corruption, the fact of the matter is that a lot of that money that was stolen it's not in the banks in Kenya or in Kinshasa or in the Philippines. It was all in Switzerland. And Switzerland, in fact, for the first time in the case of Marcos, agreed to change the law so that they could actually find the money that he had banked, that Marcos had banked, because they have all this secrecy about banking. So you have a bank account with a number and you don't know who it belongs to. So the money is stolen, is loaned by some of the same people, and then when it's stolen, they're the ones. In fact, for the most part, the money was diverted. It never even saw the light of day in the country. It went, straight from Washington or from London to a bank account in Switzerland or in the Cayman Islands and all of that. And in the case of the apartheid debt, they are actually, in German banks and Swiss banks are the biggest culprits in that.
Just a question on the same line. As we move on towards the debt relief line, have you guys also considered the importance of the so-called the victim countries in house cleaning? Because I think it's important for us to see new administration, people who will show some transparency and accountability, because you don't want to say debt relief for Kenya, then it's the same government in power again and end up messing it, going back to the same point.
And the answer is yes, and I think the Poverty Action Fund example is a really good one. And talking about future borrowing and lending, that the the system as it is stinks, it sucks, and has made a lot of people wealthy and a lot of other people very, very poor. And it's unacceptable. The cost of the debt itself in terms of people's lives and the future, generations have been mortgaged. The future of generations has been mortgaged for generations and generations to come. So all of that is part of that. One of the changes that has happened, the people of Zaire, even as they were trying to kick out Mobutu, he was being armed by the West. And so they're loaning him money, they're giving him guns. The people could not have an opportunity to kick him out. And I think that a lot of the work, just coming back to where we started in terms of what is done in the name and with the tax dollars of people in the United States and other enriched countries, is that the policies, if you look at I give the example of Pakistan, where from one day there were sanctions to the next day, the U.S. best friend is Musharraf. That the work that is done by people in this country to really change the priorities of U.S. foreign policy and of the U.S. government becomes really important, because we can point fingers and say it's the banks, it's whoever, but the fact of the matter is that if we went around here and looked at our clothing labels and looked where our clothes are made, they're made in sweatshops. The food we eat is grown in those circumstances where countries are told, now you have to grow bananas instead of what your people eat. We need to understand the culpability. It's not just like a big bad global economy out there that we have nothing to do with it. We benefit from that system. And we need to understand whether it's debt, whether it's sweatshops, whether it's in the price of oil that we pay, whether it's in the food that we eat, the ways in which the oppressive global economic system that we rage against and that we are here to discuss, actually we are beneficiaries of it. We benefit from it. Therefore, we are culpable and we are responsible for seeing that changes happen so that children are in schools not working in sweatshops and children are in hospital who need to be in hospital instead of in graves dead and buried too young, etc., etc.
And I know that Rita needs to close us, so just again to reiterate in response, there's the responsibility of the people in our partner nations to be able to keep their governments transparent and to address the issues of corruption on that side. And it is our responsibility to keep the institutions that we hold the power in and keep our governments responsible and transparent and non-corrupt in our lending and in our other relationships, and that keeps a special eye towards our military policy as well as our foreign policy. And the good news is that even though we are benefiting from this global economy, even though it does suck and is a disaster, as you've been hearing about for now several hours, especially if you were in the first session, we are powerful agents of change, and we can make the change. We can turn that around, and we've seen examples of how that's happened. We didn't get a chance really to talk about user fees. I totally forgot to get into that afterwards, so yeah, I'm relying on you. But 50 Years and Jubilee and several other groups worked to try and take apart one piece of structural adjustment, the piece called user fees on healthcare and education, where as a requirement to get debt relief, schools and hospitals were having to charge patients for to be released. And actually in Ghana recently, 40 people were held hostage in a hospital because they couldn't afford to pay the fees to be able to be released, and 20 of them were mothers that had just given birth. So right now, this is a problem right now. And through some serious works, from calls out from all over the nation, people really getting active and involved, educated on the issues of user fees and crying out for change, there was legislation that was able to pass the Congress that called on the United States to vote against any of the loans and grants and blah, 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 that included this policy of user fees, charging user fees on education and healthcare. And it actually had an impact, especially on the education side, on World Bank policy. And so World Bank went to Tanzania, where previously they had been telling the Tanzanian government that they needed to be able to charge these fees in order to help pay off their debt, and turned around and said, oh, no, take away your user fees. We're getting a lot of pressure from these debt campaigners. We're getting a lot of pressure from the United States as a result of this bill that passed Congress. So stop it already. Take away your fees on education. And what happened was that 3 million children had left school in Tanzania as a result of user fees. In 3 months, 1.5 million children returned to school. Now the problem that faces the Tanzanian government is how do we provide the resources that we need in education to be able to satisfy these children. That's a far better problem than the one that they had before, where children were completely unable to have access as a result of the fees. And so that was a direct result of action from people like you all over the country. And so as absolutely frustrating and horrifying as it is that we face a system that can feel like it just is going to beat us down, you can make the change, and you will be the agents of change. So let's bring at it.